This is always a wonderful conference. I always love coming here, and I want to thank the organizers for putting this together. It's just marvelous, and I get to see a lot of old friends and make new friends. This is I have a very difficult assignment. I have 3 papers. I have to sort of synthesize them and tell you what I think about them. 2 of the papers, strongly attack positions I've taken, and one of the papers takes positions that I never would have dreamed of taking in the other direction. So I just don't know what I'm going to do. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do them in a slightly different order in which they were presented. I'm going to start with Bob's paper because Bob's paper is about a certain set of problems in how we use constitutional language. And then I'm going to turn to Kurt's paper and to John's paper because they're about how we think about structural argument. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to just talk about methodology and use these papers as a way to talk about methodology. So when I started writing about the Commerce Clause, I was very much influenced by what Bob and Grant Nelson had written in response to Randy Barnett. And I was convinced, after reading what they did, that they had produced a significant amount of evidence suggesting that the simple theory of commerce as trade was inadequate. Which then led to the question, well, but the meaning of commerce at the time of the founding is basically exchange, right? And that's why commerce and intercourse are seen as related, because intercourse is also exchange. So if you look at the dictionaries, definitions of commerce vary. Some of them are trade, traffic, exchange, intercourse in different varieties. If you look at the word intercourse, the definitions are things like exchange, commerce, traffic, right? So one possibility is one's larger than the other, but anyway, they're about the same set of concepts. But then how do we explain Bob actually moved me in this direction, because how do we explain then that commerce includes lots of things like agriculture, manufacturing, and all these other things that he shows in his thing? And one possibility is that it's all business. But what's business? Business is people being busy and being active with each other. And then that brought me to thinking about, well, where is this coming from? And then an older conception of commerce is intercourse. That is to say, back and forth exchanges, people dealing with each other, people interacting with each other, people doing various things with each other and to each other. And that then suggested maybe, in fact, the economic model that Bob is offering is too narrow because it requires you to engage in a kind of metonym. That is, a metonym is a figure in which you take something and then you say it also means things associated with it. So the White House means the president because the president sits in the White House, right, for example. Or the throne stands for the king because the king sits on the throne. And maybe that's what's going on. The economic model seems to be a metonym, and it seems to work like that. And that suggests that the word commerce is a non-literal usage. And that would also explain the use of navigation. Navigation is a metonym. It's associated with commerce. But I said, okay, so it's possible that commerce, like of speech or writings in the Progress Clause, speech in the First Amendment are non-literal usages. It's possible there are non-literal usages. I just gave you 2. But another possibility is that it's not a non-literal usage. It's a literal usage, and it's the broader definition of intercourse. And if we say that if it's a literal usage and it's intercourse, then that explains a lot of the data that Bob and Grant showed. And it also explains another problem I had. So at first, the question was, do I adopt the sort of metonymic account of commerce, which is Bob and Grant's, which is basically a non-literal usage like writings in the Progress Clause, or do I adopt a literal definition, which is much broader in some ways and would explain a lot of things? And that was the problem I was facing. I ultimately came down on the side of not using the non-literal usage, but using the literal usage, which is intercourse. Why? Because I have another set of things that I'm worried about. So all originalists that I know of begin by saying, well, of course the First Amendment applies to technologies that didn't exist at the time of the framers. Of course it applies to electronic devices. Of course it applies to television, radio, the internet. It doesn't matter that the language that's mentioned there looks like it isn't referring to these technologies, right? Because that's the way we're faithful to the text, no matter which version of originalism we have. All originalists agree that technology has to be factored into understanding this. So, I'm a technology guy. I have an internet center at Yale, and I'm always thinking about technology. And for me, the things that were central in trying to think about the Commerce Clause today are telecommunications networks, transportation networks, and biohazards. Basically, these are the three things that I'm thinking about. So transportation networks, the framers don't really have significant transportation networks. They wouldn't even use the word network, but they did understand navigation. And they did understand that a system of navigation was essential to the effective governance of the nation, not only for economic reasons, but also for military reasons. And also the post roads clause, which is about the postal service, is actually tied to navigation, because if you're trying to send mail to England or anywhere in Europe, it goes by ship and then it goes to the post office, and then the post roads clause kicks in. So the early postal regulations are really about that, the connection between the navigation system and the postal system. Telecommunications, well, they don't understand telecommunications networks. They don't have anything like that. They do have newspapers, though, which they are traveling through the mails, and they do create a post-roads clause, but the post-roads clause is not a very good vehicle for understanding telecommunications networks. First of all, because it says to establish post roads. It doesn't say to regulate private post roads. In fact, the first bill, I believe, creates a monopoly for federal post roads. So the post roads clause is not a very good way of understanding why the government would have power over telecommunications networks. And it doesn't give you a very good way of understanding transportation networks. On the other hand, it's crazy to think that just because the technology changed and these things become increasingly salient to us, that there's no way to understand this against the background of the text. So by analogy to the way we think about the free speech clause, I said commerce is the right way to think about it, and that makes the most sense if we use the broader meaning of intercourse. Because if we use the broader meaning of intercourse, then we can capture telecommunications networks, and we can capture transportation networks. So my major concern has never been Congress regulating gossip. But it has always been Congress regulating gossip that goes through telegraphs or fraud, wire fraud, or using the internet, or transportation networks. These things are crucial to a national government. And so for me, that's the driving force. Now, Bob says we can actually get a lot of that stuff to the extent that it's done for profit. That is, for-profit transportation fits within his economic model, and for-profit communication fits within his model. Understand, this is different than whether the people who operate the networks are doing it for profit. It's whether the actual communications that travel through them are for profit, or whether the transportation, the person traveling, is doing it for profit. For me, the problem is that that doesn't capture a lot of what Congress might want to reach, or needs to reach, which is communication that's not for profit and traveling that's not for profit. It's also related to immigration, because obviously you can capture regulation of ships that flow into the ports, but what if somebody crosses the border from Mexico on foot? They're not, in other words, they're not paying anybody to do it. They're just crossing across. And the question is that, how do we comprehend that? Well, another possibility is the Law of Nations clause would allow us to do that. But the Law of Nations clause isn't well suited for that, because it says to define and punish offenses against the law of nations. And it's not clear that all immigration regulation should be understood as an offense against the law of nations. Similarly, the naturalization clause is not about who can enter the country or who can leave it. It's about who can become a citizen. So you see, so I have a bunch of problems I'm facing. Now, one other way to do it is go through John McKeil's model and just use the all other powers thing. But I was trying, you have to understand, to come up with an account of original meaning that would explain how the Constitution makes sense given changes in technology. And the final thing that hit me is as I think about technology, I think about biohazards. The basic problem of biohazards is that once you let the disease go, it crosses state lines regularly, and it isn't paying its way. It's not engaging it's not buying anything. It's people interacting with each other, breathing on each other, shaking hands with each other, moving from place to place through these networks. And that is best accounted through the idea of social intercourse. So if Congress can regulate social intercourse among the states, then it could have the power to regulate biohazards, as well as telecommunications networks, whether for-profit or not, and travel, whether for-profit or not. It all makes sense, you see. The difficulty is, from Bob's point, it's too broad. It covers too much. From my standpoint, it captures everything that we would want to think that if the framers lived today and saw our technology, that they would want to also capture. So, neither is perfect. You have to make a choice between them as to how you're going to do it, and that's the reasons I made the choices I did. But Bob says, well, is there anything that isn't captured? And I give some examples in the book, and there's a third one, which I should have mentioned in the book. I think Lopez is right. I think it's not, in fact, connected to a national problem. Actually, I'm sorry. I have to say, that takes us to the other part of my disagreement with Bob. I'm not sure it's a disagreement. There are three ways you can have a dispute about the Commerce Clause. You can have a dispute about the meaning of commerce, but you can also have a dispute about the meaning of regulate. And you can also have a dispute about the meaning of among the several states. And I think Bob and I agree about the meaning of regulate, which means it allows prohibition as well as simply channeling. And we have a dispute about the meaning of commerce, which I just described. And I've explained the reason why I don't buy his model, although I think his model is better than Randy's model. And then there could be a dispute between us about among the several states. Now, I'm not sure, because he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about that. But I always thought that the biggest dispute was not about the meaning of commerce, but it was about the meaning of among the several states. Certainly, Randy and I seriously disagree about this. In my view, among the several states is an idea that if something has effects across state lines or spillover effects across state lines, it concerns more states than one in Marshall's lingo, and therefore it's among the several states. If it doesn't, right, or Congress couldn't reasonably conclude it has spillover effects or crosses borders, then it's not among the several states. Now, of course, if you give Congress enormous leeway to make judgments and you hold it to a sort of rational basis test, as McCulloch gets close to but doesn't quite do, then you greatly expand the power of the federal government. And especially as the economy changes, it's possible for Congress to make reasoned judgments that classes of activities have these effects, which will therefore increase federal power significantly. And what Bob is worried about is that if you combine the McCulloch-style reasoning with this spillover effect logic, right, or crossing borders logic, there's nothing left. Right? That's what he's worried about. And in the book, I say there are two things that I think would not fit within this logic, and then there's another I just thought of. The two are Lopez and Morrison. Lopez strikes me as not among the several states because there's not a very good argument that by itself, the presence of a gun near a school zone is a federal problem. The issue is this a federal problem? You have federal powers to solve federal problems. Is it a problem that states, crosses state borders, which states can't do by themselves, or is it not? And so I think Lopez, that was just grandstanding. Morrison, I don't think fits under the Commerce Clause. I do, however, think that it's a classic within the paradigm case of what the Reconstruction power is about. So I agree. Morrison's probably right on Commerce Clause grounds. It's not right on Reconstruction grounds. And the third one is one I should have thought of because I spent the summer in Jupiter, Florida, the winter in Jupiter, Florida. In Jupiter, Florida, there was a fellow who had a condominium. They have a lot of condominiums in Jupiter, Florida. That's all they have on Palm Beach County. And there was a guy who was very patriotic, and he wanted to display his flag outside his condominium. And the condominium association said, that's, you can't do laundry there, you can't do all these other things there, so we're not going to let you display your condominium, flag outside the condominium. Well, this created an enormous furor. And it resulted in the 2006 Act, passed in 2005, signed by George W. Bush. The Republican Congress said, this is outrageous, unpatriotic. So it's the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2006. And it basically says that no condominium association or homeowner association shall restrain the right of a person to display the American flag in their condominium. This is really on the federal books. Go look it up. It's great. I don't think that's within the Commerce power, honestly. I don't think it's a federal problem. I mean, maybe it's under some other clause. It's just not under the Commerce Clause. So, and I think there's a whole bunch of other sort of grandstanding statutes that Congress has passed or could pass in the future that would fall under this. And so for that extent, I don't. Now, there might be other ways to do it. Now, for example, in Lopez, what they did was they just simply added, if the gun crossed state lines, and then they repassed it. And I'm sorry, Bob doesn't like it, but I don't think that, I don't think that you can do anything about that unless you want to say that crossing state lines doesn't make it a problem of interstate commerce. So anyway, that's I want to say about Bob. The last thing I want to say about Bob, because I'm basically taking up too much time, is that we may have a dispute about ACA, but I'm not sure because Bob defines commerce as voluntary transactions. So instead of saying act omission, which is what Randy's first theory was, Bob says instead look at whether the transaction was voluntary or not. And that's possible. It creates other problems because remember Title II and Title VII basically force you to engage in transactions with people you don't want to engage in. So one question is whether that would be within the commerce power. And then, of course, there's Sutton's view that, okay, you want voluntary? I'll give you voluntary. If you buy $500 worth of health care products in a year, then you have to either pay a tax or take the mandate. And so the question for Bob I want him to talk about is, how does he think about the question of voluntariness from the standpoint of the obvious puzzles that will arise? Let me switch now to Kurt. And now I want to talk not about issues of whether we read texts literally or metaphorically, but I want to talk about the general question of structural argument. How many minutes do I have?
Got five
okay.
minutes.
This actually I only need. The structural argument idea is that Kurtz has a thick conception of original meaning in which representations about how the system would work and what are part of the original meaning. And I have a thin account of original meaning in which the semantic meaning of the text is the framework, and then everything else is a matter of construction. And in particular, structural arguments play a distinctive role in the way I think about the Constitution. And I take very seriously the idea of text, structure, and history. That is, structural arguments are neither arguments from text, nor are they arguments from history. They are a special kind of argument of their own, and they can draw on text and history, but they aren't the same kind of argument. And a structural argument is an argument that says this is how the systems are supposed to work. And in making a structural argument, we may draw upon historical examples, and especially the views of people who drafted the document or ratified it. But they may not have understood how the thing was going to work once it was in motion. Nobody had ever created a federal republic like this before. And they didn't know exactly what was going to happen with the development of the party system or the national security state or with technology. And so their best guesses as to how the thing should work might be good, but they might not be. So structural arguments, in fact, aren't necessarily arguments from original intention. They aren't arguments from original intention, original understanding. They're a different kind of argument. They're argument about the proper functioning of the system. For example, John Hart Ely devotes his entire book to a structural argument. Democracy is the structural principle that should underlie interpretation. But democracy was not, in fact, as we understand it today, a structural principle at the founding. Republicanism was a structural principle at the founding. And it actually appears in the text. But democracy was held in, people had complicated views about democracy at the time of the founding. Some liked it, some didn't. Some preferred republicanism clearly and didn't like democracy. Some actually later, right? Democracy becomes a dominant principle later on. And that's why I say in my discussions with Kurt that it doesn't matter whether or not it was originally intended or even represented. The question is this the best account of the powers of the federal government? Now, Kurt and I agree that the best way to understand Resolution 6 was that it was a placeholder. That is, there was a general statement of what the structure of federal powers was going to be. And then when they got to the Committee of Detail, they said, okay, tell us, what are the powers that the federal government needs to solve federal problems? Remember, the mantra is federal powers for federal problems. And they gave a list. The list was their best shot at it. And then they went through further debate later in the convention, and they added various things and subtracted various things. But again, they're basically trying to solve the problem. What are the federal powers we need for a federal government? The claim I'm making is not that this list of powers means federal powers for federal problems, or that it's synonymous. The claim is that is why they were creating a list of enumerated powers, and that when we construe those powers today, we should keep the federal powers for federal problems in mind as a way of understanding their scope today. Now, one effect of that will be that the federal government will be much more powerful than they ever dreamed of or wanted to. But that will be because we're trying to make the best sense of how you make a federal republic work. The problem in Kurt's paper is that he doesn't give us an account. He's not trying to give us an account of why they chose the powers they chose. That is, he just notes they chose these powers and they deleted others, but there's no account of why they would choose these particular powers. And I'm trying to give an account of why that would be. Now then, and this is another dispute between Kurt and I, I'm saying once you come up with your theory of why they pick the powers they pick, that could be a guide in constructing each of the individual powers, right? So but it's not a claim about history. It's not a claim about text. It's a structural argument. There's more stuff we can talk about Wilson. In my view, whether Wilson said operations and effects or nature and operations in the two different speeches is like, I don't care. From the standpoint of what I know about Wilson and what his views were, and the fact that the Resolution 6 language is cribbed from something that he wrote in 1785 about the federal bank, it strikes me that I pretty much understand what Wilson was trying to do and what he thought. And so it doesn't matter which version of the speech was actually delivered. I mean, I have views about it. We can talk about it. But that doesn't strike me as that important. What really is important is paying attention to what Kurt's doing, which is trying to give an account of what people at the convention and people in the ratifying debates thought was being represented to them, right? And what I'm doing, which is articulating a structural principle, using history as a guide to understand how to construe the text today. Two last things. How many minutes? 2 minutes?
1 minute.
1 minute. I was blown away by this paper that John did. I was blown away. I'd never thought about this before. As I said, if you read Living Originalism, I do not make the kind of move that he makes here about the all other powers clause. I had assumed, like all other benighted souls, that all other powers refers to the powers later on in the Constitution. So, for example, the treaty power is later on. It's after Article 1, Section 8. So all other powers must refer to the treaty power, or any other powers in 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. And he said, oh, no, no, no. There's a distinction between incidental powers, which everybody learns, and implied powers. I was blown away by this. My only suggestion to him is, Godspeed, do more work, make it into something. I would lose the arguments that say that this was put over on people. That is to say, there's a certain Straussian character of the argument in this paper, which is if the cognoscenti had secret writings that they were displaying amongst each other, let's sneak it in and the rubes won't find out. I would take all that stuff out and simply say that these are a bunch of politicians, they're compromising over principles, and there were a variety of different views. The most nationalist folks really thought that the all other powers provision was significant. It really mattered to them. And as you take Lynch's book in the first decade after, they're really writing it for all they can. And that's perfectly consistent with saying that people had different views about it and emphasize different things. And you don't have to say there's any sort of gnosis or secret knowledge that's going on or anybody's putting over anything on anybody else. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think in the order in which you presented, you have 3 to 5 minutes, I've been told, to respond.
Okay, thank you, and this is a wonderful collection of papers, and thanks to Jack for his gracious willingness to talk about all of this all at the same time. I know we're going to have a broader discussion after the break about the various arguments here in the paper, so I'll just say a couple of things very quickly. One, as far as Jack's description of his work, that sounds correct to me. That certainly is how I've understood his work. And in fact, I agree with him that structural principles are not actually a part of the text, but they help us understand the text. It's important to know what the purpose was for the text. And I think that these structural principles can help guide us in our construction, again, not in our interpretation, but our actual construction of the text itself. But there has to be some reason why we choose certain principles, certain structural principles, and make certain kinds of structural arguments. And I had understood his choice of Resolution 6. The reason why he thought that was a good principle to adopt had to do with his historical arguments and the fact that he believed that there was evidence that they actually had chosen Resolution 6. They wanted it to inform the construction of Article 1, Section 8. And you get additional evidence from that from James Wilson. So he's relying on that history as kind of a handle to latch on to this particular form of structural argument. And again, I think that that's historically problematic. I don't dispute the importance of structural arguments. I simply dispute the one that he's chosen. And I think an alternative structural argument would simply be the structure of enumerated powers. That choice, the choice not to go the route of the state conventions at the time, which had, as John McHale has pointed out, often had sweeping clauses, general, go forth and do those things which state governments do, But instead they chose the structure of enumerated powers was quite significant and was key to their understanding of the Constitution. Enumerated power was a structural principle the better to serve liberty. This is all over the discussions of the Federalists, and the Anti-Federalists also understood that as well. So whatever you bring to bear on your understanding and your construction of Article 1, Section 8, I think you have to bring to it their purpose to use the mechanism of enumerated powers as a structural mechanism, the better to secure liberty. And we can talk more about that after the break. As far as John's paper is concerned, again, I thought it was wonderful. I also agree. It forces you to consider the text at a deeper level than many of us had. I shared Jack and his surprise that there might be more to the necessary and proper clause than we had considered before. And I considered John to have created a wonderful reverse Ninth Amendment understanding of federal power. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain powers shall not be construed to deny or disparage other powers retained by the national government. I think it's quite wonderful. Now, obviously, that raises a number of interesting textual conundrums. What then do we do with the actual Ninth Amendment? What then do we do with the 10th Amendment? But he's certainly right to focus us on that particular text. And what I will want to talk about more with John is how we deal with the evidence and how we deal with certain ambiguities in the evidence. For example, when John reads a particular text that refers to powers vested in the government, he reads that as a reference to the all other powers provision. I think that's correct. I would see an ambiguity there, and I would want to discuss a potential ambiguity, because of course that is not a quote of the all other powers provision. It could be a paraphrase of the all other powers provision, or it could be a paraphrase of the general theory of powers enumerated in this Constitution and given to the different departments of government. So I would want to talk about that, and we would have to have a discussion about our take on certain ambiguities in the historical evidence. But I certainly applaud him. And I think he's out, and I'll conclude with this, I think he's absolutely right to have identified the strongly nationalist understanding of power by James Wilson. Wilson did, in fact, have a theory of power that pre-existed the Constitution, powers that were actually inherent in the idea of having a national government. I think that's exactly right. I think he's right to find it in Hamilton, and I think he's right to find it in John Marshall's work. I think the issue is whether or not that was the understanding of the text of the Constitution itself, or whether or not that was a minority position. So.
Let me start with John. What's interesting is that, among other things, Jack and Akil have emphasized that there's only one commerce clause. And so the word commerce has to mean the same thing. We tend to think of there are really three commerce clauses. There's the interstate commerce clause, the foreign commerce clause, and the Indian commerce clause. And that's actually one of the strengths of their approach. John is really doing the opposite. You know, I've always thought of the necessary and proper clause as a clause, and he's pointing out that actually you could look at it as three clauses. I, again, have some questions just about how broad that power can be stretched. But my main area of expertise, alas, is the Commerce Clause, so I want to respond to Jack. The most important point is that we agree on a lot of things about the Commerce Clause, and we both disagree with Randy Barnett. So most importantly, we agree that to regulate means, prescribing uniform rules, including prohibitions. We also agree that among the several states means not just crossing state lines, but activities that occur in one state but go to another. So Grant Nelson and I said candidly, if it's commerce, it's probably among the several states. So we pin everything on the word commerce, and that's what we're debating. We concluded it meant all market-oriented transactions. Jack and Akil say, well, that's not wrong. It's just incomplete. Commerce actually is broader. It means all intercourse or interactions. That was a definition, but it was not that frequently used. It actually, in many respects, was archaic. So a lot of what Jack and Akil talk about is, commerce with the Lord, or commerce in the sense of conversations. And I don't think I don't think it's possible that it stretched that far. If it did, then the First Amendment raises some real problems. And I think that as a drafting matter, the framers would have been foolish to use. If they meant intercourse, they would have said intercourse. They wouldn't have said commerce. Gambling, that people would have realized it was referring to the secondary and much less frequently used meaning. Now, as for limits, Jack does identify some limits. Congress can't regulate guns near schools or gender-based violence, at least under the Commerce Clause, but he says they can regulate them under other powers. So where are the limits? And there's a new one, Congress can't regulate HOAs that ban flags. That's not filling me with a lot of confidence about truly limited federal government powers. If they're the only limits, and even those limits can be circumvented. So again, I don't see any genuine limits to this theory. And if that's true, then I don't think it's really a coherent, approach to limited and enumerated powers. Now, as for the voluntary limit, I want to emphasize that, I set forth that in 1999, right? This is not some post hoc rationalization that I thought up after Obamacare, like activity versus inactivity or something like that. Because I think that was the definition. It's a voluntary sale of goods and services in the market. That's what commerce is. Jack points out, the Civil Rights Act. But the Civil Rights Act did, in fact, seem to compel unwilling providers of hotel and restaurant services to serve people that didn't want to. But the Civil Rights Act, let's go back to the word regulate. What does it mean to regulate something? It means that there's some commercial activity going on, and Congress wants to make uniform rules to govern that activity. And that's what they did in the Civil Rights Act. They created a free market in public accommodations. Congress did not require customers to buy food in restaurants or to provide hotels. Congress didn't say, well, hotels and motels and restaurants and stadiums are involved in commerce. We're in an economic recession, and so it really boosts the economy. Every American must, go to restaurants 37 times this year and go to 14 hotels. I mean, that would be the analogy, I think, to what's going on with the individual mandate. And the fact is, the individual mandate is the first time under the commerce power that Congress has ever required people to purchase a product or service. So, a mandate by definition is not voluntary. That's why I think the individual mandate is unconstitutional. I think most of Obamacare is constitutional because it does regulate. There's no question that health insurance is a multi-billion-dollar interstate and international commercial enterprise. You're going to cut me off. Yeah. I will stop.
Thanks, John.
So let me begin by just thanking my fellow panelists for their kind remarks about my paper. My main objective was to put a new theory into the mix and not to suggest that somehow I was getting it all right or that there wasn't a lot more to say. I agree with Jack, and I appreciate his suggestion. I think the paper has, as it's currently written, a little bit of a Straussian maybe feel to it, or some sense that there was a kind of a two-tiered conversation going on, one among those in the know and then one among the general public. I think that's right, and I don't want to go too far in that direction. On the other hand, I think when one reads a book like Pauline Myers' Great New History of the Ratification period, you can't read that without realizing that, of course, these were savvy politicians who were engaging in various forms of propaganda, neutrally understood when they presented their various glosses on the Constitution. I think we ought to at least be open to that possibility and not take statements that are made, whether it's Wilson's State House Yard speech or various Federalist Papers and the like, just take them at face value. I think we just simply won't understand what actually happened if we do that, and that would be a mistake. Make a couple points. I'd like to intervene, if I could, on the Resolution 6 debate. I talk about it a little bit in the paper. I just want to mention, and maybe this will hopefully be something we could talk about later, I have a different view than either Jack or Kurt on this. Seems to me, if I understand them correctly, that they both think that what happened with the Committee of Detail is that Resolution 6, or actually the Bedford modification of Resolution 6, goes to the Committee of Detail along with a bunch of other resolutions, and out comes enumerated powers. And so the fundamental question is, why were enumerated powers substituted as an alternative to the broad grant of national power in Resolution 6, or in the Bedford Resolution? And that's pretty much the way I think most scholars look at the question. And now one view might say, well, there was a replacement. There was a clear move away from the broad language, replacing it with enumerated powers for various reasons. Another view might be what I take to be Jack's view. There was a kind of a fulfillment. The enumerated powers are fulfilling at a structural and principled level the broad grant of power in Resolution 6. I think both of these are not correct. And the reason, I think, has to do with the other part of Resolution 6 that we're forgetting about. So Resolution 6 actually is not just about the language that I suggest was taken from Wilson's 1785 bank essay about competence and harmony. That's a critical missing a set of provisions from Madison's correspondence prior to the convention. But Resolution 6 begins like this: resolve that each branch ought to possess the right of originating acts, and here's the crucial one, that the national legislature ought to be empowered to enjoy the legislative rights vested in Congress by the Confederation. And then it goes on to talk about legislating in all those cases in which the states are incompetent or the harmony of the Union is at stake. And if you actually look at the first paragraph that Wilson drafted, which is the beginning of the enumerated powers, before it is separated out spatially in a kind of a list, the way we have it in the final version of the Constitution, Wilson enumerated the powers in a single paragraph. And it's actually in my paper on page 31. And the fact is that the vast majority of those powers that are enumerated were powers that were given explicitly to the national government by the Articles of Confederation. The enumeration was a fulfillment of the first part of Resolution 6. And that means that we still have to ask the question, what happened to the critical language of Resolution 6 about competence and harmony that doesn't simply say what happened is that the powers were enumerated for various reasons that we might disagree about. So my understanding of what happened is that Wilson was dutifully fulfilling the first mandate of Resolution 6, enumerating all the powers that Congress already had under the Articles. And in fact, if you go through his paragraph, they match the order in which they appear in the Articles, mostly. There are a few new ones that we all understand, like commerce and taxation, and power over naturalization. But those were not what was at issue in the competence and harmony language of Resolution 6. Midway through the convention, Wilson draws, we have this in the notes in Ferrand, he has a sketch of the Patterson, New Jersey approach to the government and the nationalist approach, Federalist and nationalist. And even the New Jersey Patterson Federalist approach was perfectly willing to grant new powers over commerce and taxation. So those can't have been what were at issue in the competence and harmony broad sweeping power that was at issue in Resolution 6. What I think actually happened is that Wilson enumerated the powers, fulfilled that first mandate of the Bedford Resolution, and then there was a debate in the Committee of Detail. There was they fought it out because Rutledge and Randolph, as I suggest, were opposed to that broad language at this point in time. And I think the three Northerners were probably in favor. And I think Joseph Lynch is probably right that the all other powers provision and the necessary and proper clause was a kind of carefully worded compromise that everybody could live with, precisely because of its ambiguity. looked on the one hand to grant broad national powers, but it said nothing about what the states were incompetent to do. So it was a kind of way to defer the battles over federalism for another day. I'll stop there, but I wanted to put that out as another way to think about what we all agree are the observations. The basic observations are clear, but we don't yet, I want to suggest, have a good, compelling theory of what actually happened in the Committee of Detail, and we ought to try to get that understanding. And I think paying more attention to the complex structure of the necessary and proper clauses, to Wilson's biography, to the kinds of interests that he represented with Morris and the banking faction is the right way to go.
All right. We have about 3 or 4 minutes for this. I did form the, it came to me as the people were presenting here that at one time or another, our law school has courted all 4 of these people who are up here on the dais. So just by apropos of nothing. I have one person who has asked to be on a queue, and we'll see how far we go. We have about 3 minutes. So yes. So Chris Green, Jamal, and Ed are our first 3, and then I'll try to start a queue. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I just 2 quick questions for Bob. If Congress can regulate agriculture and manufacturing under the Commerce Clause, it seems like they could ban slavery even before the Civil War. For John, I had a question. Why can't government mean Congress? Because then all the references to powers vested in government, they refer to the 4 royal powers. And do we also get a sweeping clause for the specific grants of power to Congress later on, because Congress is neither a department nor an officer?
I really like the parents of these papers, in particular the interesting relationship between Jack's and John's, and I arrive at that by thinking, Jack's argument is exactly why people don't think he's an originalist, because you look at the state of modern government and say we can't explain this unless we read this text in a particular way, and this is a way that people who are studying the period think is less plausible. So it ends up being a kind of rule of construction in favor of national power, which would then maybe require something like John's argument, right? So the one difference with the First Amendment, with the free speech principle versus commerce, is if you read the First Amendment in light of the Ninth Amendment, you might think, well, we need to have an expansive definition of rights in this sense. You may not make the same argument with respect to commerce unless you also think that there's a basic structural principle that suggests that we should construe the Commerce Clause in a way that permits the government to function effectively.
Ed, you want to put your question?
Yeah, just very quickly, John. My question is a bit similar to Chris's and continues our dinner discussion. But basically, I mean, it seems to me that one can give meaning to this particular all powers clause. There are other powers not in Article 1, Section 8. So I don't see and it also seems to me possible that the drafters could have thought, who knows what other powers might be added or how things might be moved around. So the very fact that this is a sweeping clause seems to me that we ought not try to parse it too finely. Okay, they say government here, they say departments or offices there. They're just trying to cover everything. So I guess my question is how you can really jump to the broader argument that this is some sort of plenary authority to pursue the ends in the preamble.
I think I'm going to exercise the prerogative of saying keep those questions in mind, and we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we will begin with your responses to those 3 questions.